Greetings. I am David Ezekiel, interim pastor at the Congregational Church of Batavia, and welcome to online worship. One of the scriptures for this year's Easter season is from the book of Jeremiah. The people of Jeremiah's time were going through trauma, and Jeremiah was frustrated with their behavior for many chapters. But ultimately, his tone changes, and he prophesies God's promise that they will be built back up from the devastation that they've endured. They will again feel joy, and they will begin to plant for the future again, planting vineyards on the hills, even in the midst of exile and pain. Hear these words of promise from Jeremiah chapter 31, which serves as the basis for my message this morning. At that time, says the Lord, I will be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Thus says the Lord, the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness, when Israel sought for rest. The Lord appeared to him from far away. I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you, and I will build you, and you shall be built, O Virgin Israel. Again, you shall take your tambourines, and go forth in the dance of the merrymakers. Again, you shall plant vineyards on the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant, and shall enjoy the fruit. For there shall be a day when sentinels will call in the country of Ephraim, Come, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God. How do Jeremiah's powerful messages correlate with us, with God's people in our COVID-19 world? Now, I have noticed, as we all have, that graduations are being canceled, weddings are being postponed, and even a baptism that we would celebrate this weekend is being rescheduled. And during the spread of COVID-19, this is not a time for such assemblages of joyous celebration. Ironically, during a time of disaster in ancient Israel, the prophet Jeremiah noticed some similar circumstances. 3 times he observes that weddings had been canceled in Jerusalem because it was no time to celebrate and not a time to bet on the future. The correlation with what many of us are facing due to COVID-19 is haunting. In Jeremiah chapter 7, he acknowledges weddings are ending as death increases and bodies of dear loved ones literally begin to pile up. In Jeremiah 16, he notices that they're not even having funerals, let alone wedding feasts. And again in Jeremiah chapter 25, he anticipates the land may become a ruin and a waste. And more than any other witness in the Old Testament, in this painful moment, Jeremiah leans deeply and honestly into the difficulties being faced by his people. When the city cannot assemble for rites of passage, it is sure evidence that social life is stressed beyond measure. Likewise, in these current days, it is only the foolish who would insist on assembling and misinform their flocks that Jesus will protect us from the virus. Jeremiah could not have identified with such poor judgment because the whole world of social possibility had been shut down in his own time. And yet, at the same time, the prophet anticipates that in this place of waste, disaster, devastation, he anticipates that the sounds of festival celebration will again be heard. Life will resume in its rich social thickness and fullness. Amid the social gladness sounds, there will be songs of thanksgiving sung to the God who restores and who gives life once again. Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good, for his steadfast love endures forever, is what Jeremiah articulates just a few verses later on. Walter Brueggemann, my former professor, states, this God has the capacity to restore, recover, and revivify. This is the God of homecoming after displacement. This is the God of Easter, who has not quit, not even on that dreadful Friday or that misery lasting Saturday. It is no wonder that the older son in the parable of the prodigal son heard music and dancing. And the reason for the music and dancing is this: this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. He goes on to state that this kind of restoration can only be rendered in song and parable, two of the great trusts of the church. Now, the song of thanksgiving that Jeremiah anticipates can be expressed in that old great German anthem, Now Thank We All Our God, which was written by Pastor Martin Rinkart during the 30 Years' War of the early 1600s. And he wrote it as a table grace for his family, as a means for them to express thanksgiving. Now, let me tell you about Martin Rinkart. He was a pastor in Eilenburg, Saxony, the town of his birth. The walled city was a refuge for many fleeing war and pestilence that was occurring at that time. And left as the only clergyman in town, he often buried as many as 40 or 50 persons in one day. And even though his wife died of the pestilence, Rinkart survived. He wrote not only during the long-running war, but in the face of a fatal epidemic that decimated the population as he presided over their many deaths. We do well to ponder this simple table prayer of gratitude amidst pestilence. It reads in part, Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things hath wrought, in whom this world rejoices, who from our mother's arms hath blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. Oh, may this bounteous God through all our life be near us, with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, and keep us in God's grace, and guide us when perplexed, and free us from all ills in this world and the next. Now, the context of Pastor Rinkart's work, not unlike our own in these difficult days of COVID-19, was a scene of relentless death. Yet, he wrote and sang of thanks. The hymn invites us to cling to God's grace that frees us of all ills in all our imaginable futures. The voice of Jeremiah, echoed by this German prayer, this German hymn, provides clues even for our ministry in these days in which we exist. And we may identify two points that recur in this song of grace and in Jeremiah's expression of a hopeful future. First, we engage in a relentless, uncompromising hope. Now, this is more than a civic assurance that we will get through this together. It is rather the conviction that God will not quit until God has arrived at God's good intention. There is a purpose at work in, with, under, and beyond our best resolves. That holy purpose is tenacious, steadfast, and relentless, that we and all of God's creation will again come to well-being. And the task of the church is to hope in a way that is grounded in the good, faithful resolve and purposes of God. But the second task of our ministry is the work in the meantime, to be witnesses to the abiding, steadfast love. Steadfast love is what Brueggemann expresses as the tenacious solidarity of God that persists amid pestilence. It is the witness of Jeremiah that, in the midst of abandonment, God has not abandoned. God has not quit. Or to change the figure with Jeremiah, the seemingly barren wilderness is grace occupied. That witness is performed by both word, at which we're pretty good, and by act. The act is performed by neighborly gestures in a time of fear, by neighborly generosity and hospitality in a time of self-preoccupation, and by neighborly policies in the face of a predatory greed. This means that as the work of the church, it is our summoned to empower such policies and to celebrate them as they appear among us, even in such simple acts of generosity as contributing to the food bank, or even working towards supporting persons who have housing need during this time. These new policies then need not be aberrations for the sake of an emergency. They may indeed become for us a new normal as we work harder to ensure that all of God's people have enough. The work of ministry is to render this virus as secondary, to see that even its lethal force is outflanked by the goodness of God. Thus we have this simple witness of Pastor Rinkert with his willingness to sing and pray even with death as close as his own household. Faith is indeed, as the writer of Hebrews says, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That faith does not yield to death because it knows in the deepest ways that the goodness of God will not fold in the face of the threat of death. It boggles to know that such faith is entrusted to such fallible folk like you and me, to us. Jeremiah anticipated that the wedding, singing, and dancing would begin again, perhaps soon. In the meantime, he waited with truth-telling honesty and courage. And so shall we, with honesty and courage and truth-telling, with hopefulness that God is at work even now, bringing us towards well-being. So let us close with this prayer that we will repeat every week of the Easter season. And I'm going to line it out for you and ask you to repeat after me. Pray, we know Jesus is present among us. And now you repeat, we know Jesus is present among us. Even in this very home, even in this very hour, we will not let fear be louder than love, but with glad hearts and rejoicing souls, we will sing God's praise. For we are Easter people. Amen and amen. And may God bless you richly today.